Dad placed the glossy red key fob in Brooke's hand like he was presenting her with a crown and not a brand new Tesla parked in the driveway. The room burst into applause. Someone whistled. Mom dabbed at the corner of her eye as if this moment were sacred, and I just sat there, my palms resting on my jeans, trying to pretend that the sting crawling up my throat was not humiliation, but just another familiar ache. I had lived with that feeling my entire life. I should have been used to it by now. Brooke pressed the fob to her chest and laughed the way she always laughed, when she knew every eye in the room was on her. Dad pulled her into a hug and told her that she deserved the world. His voice carried across the living room, warm and full of pride. The Christmas tree lights flickered behind them, soft white and gold, making the moment look like something captured for a holiday commercial. Except it was my life, and I knew exactly which role was mine and which was hers. I glanced around the room, taking in the way people nodded and murmured their approval. The Cole family holiday gathering in Plano, Texas had never been subtle about favorites. Not when we were children, not now. The air smelled like cinnamon and pot roast and something else, something I had lived with for more than 30 years. Being overlooked has a scent. It sticks to your skin. Maybe you understand that feeling. And before I go any further, I want to ask something simple. What are you doing while listening to this story right now? For me, on the night this happened, I was standing under the glow of that Christmas tree, pretending I did not feel, hollowed out. If this story reminds you of anything from your own life, I hope you will share it later. These moments shape us more than we admit. Mom cleared her throat and told the room to settle because there were still more gifts to open. Her smile softened as she turned toward me, though it never reached her eyes. She handed me a small box wrapped in leftover paper from last year. I already knew it was nothing special. I knew because they saved their excitement for Brooke. They always did. But even then, I could not have predicted what was inside. I lifted the lid. A ceramic piggy bank sat inside, chipped near one ear, the kind you find on a clearance shelf. A single $10 bill poked out of the slot. I could hear the rustle of paper in the sudden quiet, as if the entire room was waiting to see how I would react. David chuckled, the sound too loud, almost jovial. He said that was their contribution to my future home. He said it as if it were clever, as if it were funny, as if $10 in a chipped piggy bank were a blessing, and not a reminder that I had never been worth the same effort as Brooke. I looked at him, then at Mom. No one in that room seemed to understand the cruelty of the moment. Or worse, they understood and simply did not care. Brooke let out a soft laugh under her breath. She did not bother to hide it. Why should she? She had won again. She always did. For a second, everything in the room seemed to mute. The laughter, the clinking glasses, the music playing from Dad's old speaker. I felt my pulse in my temples, steady and cold. Not rage, exactly. Not sadness, either. Something deeper, a kind of exhaustion that sits at the bottom of your ribs until you finally decide to stop carrying what was never yours to carry. I did not make a scene. I did not cry. I did not break. I set the piggy bank on my lap and smoothed the wrapping paper beside me as if nothing had shifted in my world. But everything had. Brooke twirled the key fob between her fingers, bragging to an aunt about how she could not wait to drive her Tesla to Dallas. The next morning, Mom fussed over her scarf, telling her she needed to take a picture beside the car before the night ended. David called her a superstar. I sat quietly while they praised her. Something inside me detached, like the last thread snapping. I stood up slowly. Dad barely glanced at me. Mom did not turn her head. Brooke smiled just enough to tell me she had noticed everything and enjoyed it. I cleared my throat and said I needed some air. I said it politely, the way I always did. No one asked if I was all right. I carried the piggy bank with me as I walked down the hallway, past the framed photos of Brooke winning competitions, Brooke painting, Brooke receiving awards. There were no photos of me. Not in that hallway. Not in any hallway. There never had been. When I reached the front door, I paused. The night outside was still. The lawn glowed beneath the Christmas lights strung along the roof. Cold air pressed against the windows. It was Christmas. Families everywhere were settling into warmth and comfort. I was about to do something I had never done before. I stepped out. The chill hit my face, burning and clean. I walked to my car, each step steady, each breath slower than the last. I did not look back at the house. I had spent my life looking back, hoping for change that never came. Tonight, I was done. I opened the passenger door and placed the piggy bank on the seat. For a moment, I stared at it. That ridiculous little thing. It should not have mattered. It should not have carried the weight it carried. But humiliation does not come from the size of the gift. It comes from the intent behind it. Inside the house, laughter echoed faintly through the closed door. Brooke's voice rose above the others. The sound hit me harder than I expected. I slid into the driver's seat and closed the door. Silence wrapped around me, thick and absolute. I gripped the steering wheel and let my eyes fall shut. If I stayed one more minute, I would shatter. If I drove away, I did not know what would happen next. But the truth settled in my chest. Staying had already broken me. Leaving might save whatever was left. I started the engine. The headlights cut across the yard, sweeping past the shadow of the Tesla parked proudly at the curb. Brooke's new Triumph. The car gleamed under the lights like a trophy. I watched it for a moment, my jaw tight. Not because I wanted it, but because of what it meant. What it had always meant. Worth. Value. Favor. Things I had never been given freely by the people who should have known my value before anyone else. I pulled out of the driveway, the tires crunching softly over the cold pavement. Plano's quiet streets stretched ahead of me, lined with houses glowing warm through their windows. Families together, sharing love that did not have to be earned or performed. I wondered for a brief second what that felt like. The further I drove, the lighter my chest became. Not comfortable, not happy, but open. A different kind of ache than the one I had carried all night. The piggy bank shifted slightly as I turned onto the main road. I reached over and steadied it with one hand, feeling the cold ceramic under my palm. Something in the weight of it made me pause. I told myself it was just a cheap gift. It meant nothing, but I kept my hand on it a moment longer. Street lights flickered past, each glow marking a small piece of distance from the life I had finally walked away from. The highway entrance came into view. A quiet certainty settled into place. I was not going back. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. The roads were nearly empty, a few cars scattered like ghosts in the dark. I drove without music, without distraction, letting the hum of the engine fill the silence. My thoughts drifted to the years that had led me here. Every moment I swallowed my hurt. Every time I convinced myself I was imagining favoritism. Every holiday that ended with me alone in my room while Brooke soaked in applause. Tonight was not new. It was simply undeniable. When I reached the edge of town, I slowed the car and pulled into an empty parking lot beside a closed convenience store. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting a dull red glow across the pavement. I parked beneath it and exhaled. My breath shook, but not from fear, from release. For the first time in my life, there was no script, no expectation, no role I had to fill. Just me. A chipped piggy bank, a $10 bill inside it, and a future no longer dictated by a family who never saw me. I rested my forehead on the steering wheel. The cold leather steadied me. Somewhere deep in my chest, a single thought surfaced. A warning. A promise. They thought they had given me nothing. They had no idea what they truly handed me. I sat up, wiped the moisture from my eyes, and looked at the piggy bank again. The air felt different. The night felt wider. There was something here, something I could not name yet. But the road ahead was open, and I was finally ready to follow it. I turned the key again, letting the engine settle into a low rumble. Then I pulled back onto the road, heading toward whatever came next. Leaving the glow of my family's house far behind me, the road stretched out ahead of me as I drove away from Plano, the glow of my family's house shrinking in the rearview mirror until it disappeared entirely. The dark felt cleaner than the air inside that living room, quieter than the applause still ringing in my ears. I kept driving until I reached my apartment complex on the north side of town, a modest beige building with flickering porch lights and a gravel parking lot that always looked tired. I shut off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the ticking of the cooling metal, my hand resting on the piggy bank beside me. It felt heavier now, though I told myself it was just exhaustion. I carried it upstairs, the chipped ceramic cold against my palm. When I stepped into my apartment, the silence wrapped around me like a blanket. No holiday music, no chatter. No one else's celebration is drowning out my existence. Just me. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint smell of pine from the small tree I had decorated alone last week. I locked the door behind me and placed the piggy bank on the kitchen table. For a long moment, I simply stood there, staring at it under the dim yellow light. I had spent most of my life being told I did not need much, that I was self-sufficient, responsible, the one who would be fine. Dad said it like praise. Mom said it was a relief. Brooke said it like an accusation. Every label formed a layer inside me until it became easier to act the part, then question whether it was ever true. I pulled out a chair and sat down, letting the warmth from the seat seep through the fabric of my jeans. The piggy bank sat in the center of the table like a quiet witness, a $10 contribution to my future home. If I replayed the scene in my mind, David's tone bothered me more than the gift itself. It was never the money, it was the message. Their expectations for Brooke were skyscrapers. Their expectations for me were tiny, disposable, something they could flick away with a joke. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. My thoughts drifted to one afternoon a few months ago when Mom and I sat in her backyard, while Brooke was showing someone her new artwork inside. Mom had handed me iced tea and told me she was proud of how independent I had become. "You have always been strong," she said. "You do not need us to worry about you." Her tone was gentle, but it was also a dismissal, a way of telling me she did not intend to step into the places where a mother should have been. On another day, when Brooke ran into trouble with her job, Mom and Dad rearranged their entire week to help her. They canceled plans, drove across town, talked to anyone who might smooth the path for her. I remember sitting at the kitchen counter that same week while Mom told me, Brooke just needed someone to lean on. I asked if I had ever leaned too hard on them. Mom laughed softly, brushed my hand, and said I was different. I did not need that kind of help. I was the one who figured things out on my own. I used to take pride in that. I thought being the strong one gave me some kind of quiet dignity, but dignity turns sour when you realize people use it as an excuse not to show up for you. Tonight proved that more clearly than anything else. I stood up and went to the sink, filled a glass with water, and took a long drink. My reflection in the window looked pale, tired, but not broken. I set the glass down and walked back to the table. My fingers brushed the chipped ear of the piggy bank. There was a roughness to it that reminded me of all the small, careless ways my parents had shown me who they were. The weight of the piggy bank nagged at me again. I pushed it lightly with my fingertips, then picked it up entirely. When I tilted it to the side, something shifted inside. Not the soft flutter of a single bill. Something else. Something that felt wrong for a joke gift meant to embarrass me. I turned it again. The sound was heavier, muted, and solid. I frowned. Maybe they put coins in there as well. Maybe it was just loose change and the $10 bill was on top. But even that did not sound right. Coins have a soft scatter when they move. This was thicker. I held it closer to my ear and shook it again. The weight rolled slowly, like something dense and packed. I set it back down on the table, feeling an unexpected flutter beneath my ribs. Confusion at first, curiosity second. It could have been anything. A handful of quarters, a few old souvenirs, something Dad tossed inside without thinking. He was the type to put random items in drawers and containers if he did not. Nowhere else to put them. But something inside me did not believe this was careless. Something felt intentional, though I could not explain why. I leaned back in the chair, letting my gaze soften as I took in the dim kitchen. The pale light from the overhead fixture washed over the table, the piggy bank casting a rounded shadow. I pressed my thumb against the ceramic again, tracing the small fracture near the ear. It had clearly been handled before, used before. Not a new store-bought gag, it was older. For a moment, the room felt still, as if waiting with me. The silence was heavy, but not suffocating. It was the kind of quiet that follows a long-awaited realization, though I did not yet know what that realization was. My mind flicked back to Mom's voice, the way she always said I did not need anything. She believed it. Dad believed it. Maybe I believed it once too. Mained here tonight, though, I recognized how that belief had shaped everything. They had convinced themselves they did not owe me attention because I had learned to survive without it. They had convinced themselves Brooke deserved their devotion because she asked for it, loudly, constantly, fearlessly. I ran my hand over my face. The fatigue of the night settled in my bones. I should have gone to bed. I should have left the piggy bank where it was and dealt with it in the morning. But the strange heaviness inside it tugged at my thoughts. I picked it up again, this time using both hands. The temperature of the ceramic had warmed from my touch. I pressed my thumb against the slot where the $10 bill stuck out, slightly. The paper felt crisp, new, almost untouched. I pulled it out halfway, then slid it back in. It was not the bill that rattled. I took a slow breath. My heart beat a little faster. Not with dread, not with excitement, but with a sense that something was slightly out of place, a puzzle piece that did not fit the picture I had known for years. The kitchen clock ticked toward 1 in the morning. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a gust of wind pressed against the window. I sat back down, pulling the piggy bank toward me. I tried to remember if I had ever seen it before. Not recently, not as a child, not at any point in our home. It was generic enough that I might have overlooked it for years, or maybe it was something they grabbed from a closet without much thought. Either way, the strangeness of the weight would not leave me. I cupped the piggy bank in both palms again and gave it a gentle shake. The object inside rolled from one side to the other with a dense thud. Not coins, not a toy, something else entirely. I placed it back on the table carefully, as if it were fragile. Maybe it was. Maybe I was. I exhaled slowly, steadying my hands. I knew I could crack it open now. I knew all I needed was to grab a towel, wrap it, and split it against the counter. The answer was right there. But tonight had already taken so much from me. The humiliation, the weight of old wounds, the quiet exit from a home that had never really held me. I was too tired to face one more truth, whatever it might be. I pushed the piggy bank slightly away from me and stood up. My legs felt heavy as I crossed the room toward the hallway. Halfway there, I paused and looked back at it sitting on the table. The chipped ear, the faint shine from the ceramic, the odd weight inside. It looked like nothing, yet something in it called to me with a quiet insistence. I walked back, picked it up one last time, and held it against my chest. It feels warm now. Familiar in a strange way. I set it on the counter near the coffee maker where I would not forget it. I whispered to the empty room, maybe to myself, maybe to whatever waited inside that ceramic shell, that I would deal with it in the morning. I turned off the kitchen light, the room falling into darkness except for the faint glow from the street lamp outside. The shadow of the piggy bank stretched across the counter. I watched it for a moment, then walked toward my bedroom, letting the cool air follow me down the hall. Behind me, the apartment settled into silence. Something inside me shifted, quiet but certain. Tomorrow, I will open it, and whatever was inside, I would finally see it for what it was. Morning light crept through the blinds before I even opened my eyes. I lay still for a moment, listening to the soft hum of the heater and the faint sounds of a car starting. Somewhere in the parking lot, the weight of the night before pressed against me, but something else nudged its way through. Curiosity, a quiet insistence that had been sitting in my chest ever since I placed the piggy bank on the counter. I pushed the blankets aside and walked into the kitchen barefoot. The tile was cool, the kind of cool that wakes you all at once. The piggy bank sat where I had left it, angled slightly, as if it had been waiting. The chipped ear caught the edge of the morning sun. For a moment, I simply looked at it, my breath steady. Then I reached out and held it in both hands. The weight was unmistakable, solid, intentional. Not what I expected from a $10 joke gift. As I stood there with it in my hands, a memory stirred. It rose quietly, like a photograph someone slipped under a door. I was 10 years old, sitting on a wooden stool inside my grandfather Walter's workshop. The room smelled like sawdust and tobacco, warm and dry. He had a small workbench near the window where he carved birds out of blocks of cedar. I used to watch the curls of wood fall to the ground and gather around his boots. Dad did not spend much time there. He thought all of it was pointless. His phrase for grandfather's hobby was wasted time. Grandfather never argued. He did not defend himself. He just kept carving, kept humming under his breath, and kept living by rules no one else cared to understand. One afternoon, he opened a small tin box that sat on the highest shelf of his workshop. Inside were coins wrapped in tissue paper. Some were dark with age. Others shone faintly under the sunlight. He let me hold one of them, a penny that looked nothing like the ones I saw at the grocery store. He pointed to the date on it with a gentle tap of his finger. He told me that the value was not about the number printed on its face. He said the worth of something came from rarity, from who touched it before, from history carried quietly in its fibers or metal. He said most people look at things and see only what is obvious. Few take the time to see what something really is. Value does not sit on the surface. He said it again, softer, as if saying it twice would help it sink into the places where truths live. Dad walked in at that moment, brushing sawdust from his jacket sleeve as if the air offended him. He saw the tin box and asked Grandfather why he wasted money on junk. His voice held that mocking edge he used whenever he wanted to feel bigger than someone else. Grandfather did not reply. He just smiled at me and closed the tin carefully. Later, when Dad was out of earshot, Grandfather leaned close and told me something I never forgot. A child who learns to see value for herself will never be fooled by what others want her to believe. I never understood how much that sentence would matter. Not until now. The memory dissolved slowly, like dust settling, and I found myself back in my kitchen, holding the piggy bank between my palms. My pulse picked up. I walked to the drawer beside the sink and pulled out a small kitchen towel. If something inside was fragile or important, I did not want to break it carelessly. I wrapped the piggy bank inside the towel, held it for a breath, then brought it down lightly against the counter. The ceramic cracked. Not a dramatic shatter, just a soft give. I lifted the towel and applied pressure again. The body split, the sound sharp but controlled. When I unwrapped the pieces, the pig no longer hid anything. A stack of old coins spilled out onto the towel. They glinted under the morning sunlight, though some edges were dulled by age. I stared at them, my breath caught somewhere in my throat. These were not quarters or loose pennies. They were older, darker, their surfaces smooth from decades of being touched and handled. A few were wrapped in what looked like tiny squares of thin paper, worn soft, from time. One sat on top, that made my heart stop for a moment. I lifted it gently by its edges. It was a penny, but not like any I had seen in years. The date stamped on it pulled the breath from my lungs. 1909. I blinked as if that would change what I was seeing, but it did not. It was unmistakable. A Lincoln wheat penny, old enough to be rare enough to be valuable, at least if Grandfather's quiet lessons were still true. I picked up another coin. Then another. They were all old, all deliberately placed, carefully chosen. This was not a random collection tossed inside a piggy bank. It was deliberate, and it was hidden. My throat tightened as a memory surfaced. Grandfather's hand on mine as he let me hold a coin from his collection. God called it junk. Grandfather smiled as if he knew something he would never understand. I sank into the chair at the table. The towel spread out before me with the coins lined up like a trail of clues. My mind raced through every holiday, every birthday, every conversation with Mom and Dad. They never spoke about Grandfather's collection. They never mentioned where his things went after he passed. They sorted through his belongings quickly, too quickly, and Brooke never cared enough to ask. But I cared. I always had. My grandmother died when I was 5, and Grandfather became the steady presence I gravitated toward. He did not speak much, but he listened in a way that made me feel seen. He fixed small toys for me without making me feel silly for breaking them. He taught me how to sand wood until it felt like silk, and he showed me that worth was something quiet, something you learned to recognize. He once told me that value is not what the world tells you it is. If you let others decide for you, you will always come up short. I touched the penny again. The metal was cool and smooth against my skin. A warmth rose in my chest so sudden it startled me. It was not anger. It was not sadness. It was recognition. He had left these for me. I did not know how, or when, or why they ended up inside a piggy bank that Dad mocked at Christmas. But I knew what these coins represented. I knew grandfather's handwriting, in the shape of every choice he ever made. He did not waste anything. He did not misplace anything. If something was here, it was here because he intended it. I stared at the spread of coins. They were worth something. Maybe not much. Maybe a lot. I did not know yet. But I knew they were not ordinary. These were not tokens or trinkets. They were pieces of history, pieces of him, and Mom and Dad gave them to me without knowing what they were. For a moment, the room felt smaller, as if walls had shifted closer. My breath slowed. The realization settled like a stone at the bottom of a pond, heavy but clear. They handed me something they did not understand. I ran my fingertip along the edge of the towel, grounding myself. The coins caught little sparks of light as the sun continued to rise. Each one felt like a whisper from a man who saw me differently from the rest, of the family. Not as the strong one who needed nothing, not as the shadow beside Brooke, just as someone worthy of attention, someone worth leaving something meaningful to. I sat back slowly, letting the magnitude of the moment sink in. The piggy bank had been a joke to them, a quiet humiliation. Another reminder that I was expected to accept less and smile anyway. But this was not $10. This was something else entirely. Something Dad never took the time to understand. Something Mom overlooked. Something Brooke would have dismissed as clutter. But Grandfather knew, and maybe, just maybe, he knew I would be the one to find it. The morning light shifted across the table. I lifted the towel carefully, gathering the coins in both hands. They were cool and smooth, and heavier than I expected. A quiet certainty settled over me as I placed the coins gently inside a small bowl and set it at the center of the table. My heartbeat steadied. My breath deepened. I did not know what these coins were worth, but I knew, with a clarity that felt like truth, that I was holding something my family had ignored, something they likely never appreciated. And in that moment, I felt it, a strong, unshakable instinct. Whatever this was, whatever Grandfather had left behind, it mattered. It mattered in a way none of them had seen. But I did. I stood slowly, the bowl of coins sitting quietly at the center of the kitchen table, waiting for whatever came next. I stood for a long moment, just looking at the bowl in the center of my kitchen table, the coins catching bits of morning light like quiet signals. The house around me felt unusually still, as if waiting for me to catch up to the truth sitting right in front of me. My heartbeat had settled, but something inside me had not. I pulled out a chair and sat down, leaning forward until the edges of the bowl came into focus. I reached for the 1909 penny again and held it between my thumb and index finger. The weight of it was small, but it carried something that made the room feel heavier. I set it back down and grabbed my laptop from the counter. It took a minute to boot up, just long enough for me to wonder whether I was chasing nothing more than nostalgia. But when the screen finally lit, I typed in the date and description of the coin with a level of concentration I had not felt in years. Search results filled the page, headlines and collector forums and old auction records. I clicked on the first link and skimmed quickly. My breath stuck halfway down my throat. The words rare and sought after and early Lincoln issue flashed across the screen. I moved to another page. Then another. Each one confirmed something I still struggled to accept. Some 1909 pennies, depending on mint marks and details, had sold for thousands. Sometimes tens of thousands if conditions aligned. I pulled the laptop closer and kept reading. My fingers tingled slightly as I clicked through photographs, trying to compare the details to the ones sitting on my table. I was not a collector. I did not know the fine points, but even with my limited understanding, the similarities were too clear to ignore. The serif on the date, the grain of the metal. The imprint is worn, but still present. It matched more than it differed. I pushed back slightly from the table, the chair legs scraping softly against the floor. I whispered a quiet question to the empty room. "What are you doing here?" My pulse thudded again as I reached for another coin. This one bore the year 1913. Another search confirmed it was uncommon. Then, a 1915 coin, wrapped in a thinning piece of paper that looked like it had been folded decades ago. I typed its description into the search bar, and another list of collector sites appeared. That one, too, held value. Not massive, but more than pocket change. My chest tightened, a slow coil of disbelief tightening beneath my ribs. Grandfather's way of seeing the world was woven into everything he touched. He kept small things that meant big things. He repaired items instead of throwing them out. David always rolled his eyes and said grandfather lived in a museum of outdated clutter. He called the coin collection a pile of old metal. Nothing more. He said it tasted like dust and pointless nostalgia, but I remembered how grandfather lifted each coin when he handled them, not casually, not dismissively. He held them with intention, as if each one told a story he had memorized long before. I sat back down. My hands felt warm, my thoughts scattered but sharp. There was only one way to know the truth. I needed someone who understood coins the way grandfather once did, someone who could tell me exactly what I was holding. I grabbed my phone and searched for coin appraisal services near Plano. A few listings appeared. One stood out. Monroe Numismatic Services, a specialist named Lydia Monroe who had been featured in a Regional Collectors magazine. Her reviews mentioned accuracy, honesty, and an eye for historical detail. I stared at her name for a moment before calling. She answered with a businesslike tone that softened only slightly when I explained what I found. She asked a few quick questions, then told me she had an opening that afternoon if I could bring the coins in. I agreed faster than I intended, the words catching in my throat. The rest, I cleaned the kitchen twice, though it did not need it. I paced from the living room to the window, checking the clock every few minutes. By the time noon approached, the air in the apartment felt too tight. I gathered the coins carefully, wrapping each one in a soft cloth, then placed them inside a small container. When I held it, the weight steadied my nerves. I grabbed my keys and drove to a small storefront on the east side of Plano. The building looked unassuming, a beige structure with a modest sign and a single glass door. Glass cases lined the walls, housing coins and currency from different eras. A soft light illuminated everything, giving it the feel of a quiet museum. A woman in her early 50s looked up from behind the counter as I entered. She had short silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in details before her mind even processed them. She greeted me kindly and asked what I had brought. I placed the wrapped coins on the counter. She unfolded the cloth with careful fingers, her expression neutral at first as she lifted the 1909 penny. Her breath stopped halfway through a word. It was subtle, but I noticed. She held it closer to the light, turned it slightly, then reached for a magnifying tool. Her tone shifted. The polite business voice she greeted me with was gone. Something more focused took its place. She asked where I got these. I told her the truth as best I could. They were in a piggy bank my parents gave me for Christmas. She raised an eyebrow at that, as if the comment itself carried its own story. She did not press further. She moved on to the 1913 coin, then the 1915, then another wrapped piece I had barely inspected myself. She handled each one with slow deliberation, her gaze narrowing slightly with every turn of her wrist. When she finally looked up at me, her expression held a seriousness that prickled across my skin. She said I did not understand what I was holding. Her voice was calm, not dramatic, the kind of calm that carries more weight than an exclamation. I swallowed, trying to steady my breathing as she continued examining another coin. She explained that these pieces were not random. They were curated, preserved, selected by someone who knew what they were doing. She said collectors spend years searching for coins like these. She said there was a possibility, depending on specific markings and conditions, that some were considerably valuable. A warmth spread through my chest, then sank into my stomach where it twisted into something else. Not fear, not excitement, something between disbelief and clarity. She asked if she could keep them for further evaluation. She wanted to analyze them closely, compare them to reference materials, and determine whether certain rare features were present. She promised to handle them carefully and contact me as soon as she had answers. I nodded. My throat felt tight, words stuck somewhere behind the realization forming inside me. Grandfather left these. I knew it now, without question. David never understood value beyond what he could see and spend. Mom never looked closer at anything she thought did not belong to her version of what mattered. Brooke would never imagine something as small as a penny mattered at all. I felt suddenly protective and strangely honored. As I stepped out of the shop, the air hit my face with a coolness that felt sharper than when I walked in. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the car door. I sat behind the wheel for a moment before turning the key. Hope flickered, uncertain and unfamiliar, mixed with a deep unease that pressed against my ribs. If these coins were valuable, truly valuable, then my parents had no idea what they gave me. And that meant something else. They had thrown away a piece of grandfather's legacy without looking closely. Enough to see it. I rested my hands on the steering wheel, letting the silence settle. The road outside stretched steady and quiet. I did not know what Lydia would find, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever this was, it was bigger than a $10 joke. It was the beginning. The road home from Lydia's shop felt different than the road I had driven down only 30 minutes earlier. I kept both hands on the wheel, knuckles pale, the hum of the engine barely cutting through the noise in my mind. I pulled into my apartment complex and parked, but I did not turn off the ignition at first. I just sat there, watching a leaf scrape across the parking lot in the winter wind. My phone buzzed. A message from Lydia asking me to stop by again when I had a few minutes. She had finished the preliminary check sooner than expected. My stomach tightened in a way that told me this was not going to be a simple conversation. I backed out of the spot and drove right back. The shop was quiet when I walked in. A small bell chimed above the door. Lydia was standing behind the counter with her glasses perched low on her nose, her posture stiff. She looked up, and her expression told me everything before she even spoke. She asked me to come closer. She had the coins lined up on a velvet pad, each one in a small protective sleeve she must have added while I was gone. The arrangement was neat and deliberate, a stark contrast to how they had spilled from the broken piggy bank that morning. She took a breath and told me she was going to explain everything clearly. I braced my hands on the edge of the counter because suddenly my legs did not feel steady. She said the 1909 penny was not just a common issue. It appeared to be a rare early Lincoln release with markings that matched those found in highly sought-after collections. She would still run one final test, but early indicators were promising. Then she pointed to the 1913 coin. Another rarity. Then the 1915 pieces wrapped in tissue. She explained that it, too, might be worth significantly more than the face value most people ever consider. Finally, she stepped back and looked at the entire set. She said the value was not in a single penny or a single year. It was the completeness of the grouping, the preservation, the intention behind how each piece fits into a larger timeline. She said collectors look for sets crafted by knowledgeable hands, and this was clearly one of those sets. My heart thudded so hard I could feel the pulse in my neck. She picked up a sheet of paper where she had written a range of estimated values based on recent auction results, condition, rarity, and historical context. The number she gave me was $380,000. I repeated it quietly, the syllables thick in my throat as if they did not belong to real speech. My hands curled slightly against the counter. $380,000. That was the value of what had been hidden inside a ceramic pig sold as a joke on Christmas night. Dad's voice echoed in my mind, warm and smug as he said it was their contribution to my future home. A $10 bill and $380,000 disguised as mockery. I did not laugh. I did not gasp. A coldness moved through my chest instead, settling deep and heavy like winter ice forming on a still lake. I stared at the numbers again, trying to reconcile them with the memory of Dad's grin, Brooke's little laugh, the dismissive glances from relatives who never saw me as anything but background to Brooke's spotlight. Lydia touched my arm lightly, grounding me. She asked if I was all right. I nodded, because words were not ready yet. She told me she could help me find a reputable auction house, but she urged patience. The market fluctuated. She advised selling in phases, not all at once, to preserve leverage and attract serious bidders. She explained that provenance mattered, and she believed these coins came from a collector who took his time curating them. I swallowed hard. My grandfather's hands carved birds out of cedar and collected pieces of history in tin boxes no one else valued. Of course, he would be the one who left something behind without making a show of it. And of course, my family would be the ones to toss it into a piggy bank because they never bothered to look twice. I told Lydia I would like to move forward with care. She nodded approvingly. She said she would begin contacting trusted collectors she knew personally. She would keep the coins secured in her vault until I decided on the final route. I agreed, though inside, everything felt unsteady. As I stepped back outside, the winter air hit me with a sharpness that brought my breath back. I walked slowly to my car, the sunlight reflecting off the hood. My hands trembled when I reached for the door. $380,000. A number that large did not feel real to someone who had always bought secondhand furniture and drove a car older than Brooke's college degree. A number that large felt like a mistake or a setup or something I was not meant to hold. But I was holding it. My grandfather left it for me. And Dad had given it away without knowing. There was something poetic in that. Something almost too sharp to touch. I sat in the car and rested my forehead on the steering wheel. The cold leather steadied me the way it had the night before when I parked outside the convenience store. Everything had changed, and yet somehow everything felt exactly as predictable as it always had been. My family had spent my entire life underestimating me. Tonight, Dad had boxed it into one final insult and tied a bow around it. Their $10 gift. Their future home joke, their assumption that I should smile and accept less, and in doing so, they handed me $380,000. It was not funny. It was not triumphant. It was something darker, something sharper. Karma begins not with justice, but with irony. I turned the ignition and drove home. When I walked into my apartment, the broken ceramic pieces were still on the kitchen counter. I picked one up and turned it between my fingers. The chipped ear was still attached, rough along the break. I placed it down gently, then poured myself a glass of water and sat at the table. The place where the bowl had sat that morning was empty now. Lydia had taken the coins for safekeeping. Only the phantom weight of them remained in the space before me. I leaned back in the chair, feeling the tension drain slowly from my shoulders. What was I supposed to do now? The obvious answer was to celebrate, to scream into the air, to feel vindicated. But none of that found me. What settled instead was a quiet clarity. I did not need to call my family and inform them of anything. I did not need to wave this in front of Brooke or rub it into Dad's face. Silence was the most powerful reaction I could have. I pulled my laptop closer and began to search for investment options. Real estate opportunities in Plano. Small business ventures. Markets I had never explored. A life built intentionally instead of reactively. The choices were suddenly wide, almost overwhelming. But I did not panic. I took my time. Grandfather had always said that real value was not what people see, but what you decide to build. I felt his hand in this moment, guiding me as if he were sitting in the chair across from me. I would sell the coins piece by piece at the right time. I would reinvest every dollar with purpose. I would not waste a single cent trying to prove anything to a family who had already shown me who they were. No. I would build something for myself, quietly, strongly, permanently. As I sat there with the laptop open and the winter light fading across the window, I realized something else. Karma had not struck yet. Not fully. What had happened today was only the beginning. The first small shift. The first consequence of a lifetime of being overlooked. This was not revenge. This was an awakening. I closed the laptop, suddenly aware of how calm my heartbeat had become. The stillness in the room felt less like emptiness and more like possibility. I would invest. I would grow. I would become someone my family never imagined. Not for them, for me. I stood up and walked toward the window. Outside, the sun was dipping low, casting the parking lot in soft gold. The world looked unchanged, but I knew I was not the same person who had walked out on Christmas night. I was holding something bigger than wealth. I was holding a decision, and I already knew which direction I was going to take, and that knowing settled somewhere deep in my chest as the days that followed began to unfold. The new year crept in quietly, without celebration, without family gatherings or clinking glasses. I spent most mornings sitting at my kitchen table with a notebook and my laptop, working through numbers, researching options, and planning steps with a focus I had never felt before. Lydia called me every few days with updates. A collector in Chicago wanted to see one of the early Lincoln pieces. A museum in Colorado had expressed interest in a matching pair from the set. Each call brought more clarity. The value was real. The opportunity was real. And the responsibility of what grandfather had left me felt heavier in a way that steadied rather than scared. I reached out to a financial advisor named Noah Ellison. He worked with mid-sized investments and had a reputation for being straightforward and patient. When I met him at a small office in Fort Worth, he greeted me with a firm handshake and a quiet, focused expression. He had salt and pepper hair and a way of speaking that made even complicated terms feel understandable. We sat across from each other in a room with muted green walls and a framed photograph of a Texas prairie hanging behind him. I told him everything. The coins, the appraisal, the plan to sell slowly, the desire to invest with intention rather than impulse. He listened without interrupting, taking notes as if every detail mattered. When I finished, he leaned back slightly and told me that I was already ahead of most people who came into his office. Not because of the money, but because of the mindset. He said people rush to buy shiny things when they come into sudden wealth. Cars, trips, things that look good on camera but do not build anything. I admitted quietly that a part of me did want to prove something, to show Mom and Dad they had been wrong, to stand in front of them with a life they never believed I could build. Noah looked at me for a long moment before he said something that stuck with me. He told me proving people wrong is not the same as proving yourself right. Those words sank into me like a stone dropping into a deep pond. We worked through financial options together. He helped me map out a down payment for a home in Fort Worth, something modest but solid, a place that would appreciate time and give me root. We looked at listings, neighborhoods, and growth projections. When I walked into a small brick house on a quiet street lined with oak trees, I felt something ease inside me. The living room had sunlight streaming through large windows, and the faint scent of old wood that reminded me of grandfather's workshop. I placed my hand on the door frame and knew. This was the place. I made the offer that same week. The seller accepted. I put down the payment using the first portion of the funds that came through from the initial sale of a single, rare coin. One piece, one small part of the collection. Enough to secure a home. After the house was underway, I turned to the dream I had carried since college. A bookstore and stationery shop. Something warm and community-centered. A place where people could slow down, breathe, and touch things made by real hands. Dad always called it a childish idea, a hobby, not a business. He said bookstores do not survive anymore. He said I needed to be practical, and practical meant doing things that did not interest me, but made sense to him. His voice echoed in my head as I drove through Fort Worth, looking at small commercial spaces for rent. I pushed the echo away each time, but it kept slipping back in like a draft through a cracked window. I could hear him calling my idea silly. I could hear Mom saying I was strong enough to get by without help. I could hear Brooke laughing the way she did when she thought something was beneath her notice. But I kept driving. I visited a handful of places before finding a narrow storefront tucked between a vintage clothing shop and an old barber shop. The windows were dusty. The sign above the door was faded. The floor creaked when I stepped inside. But the space was perfect. High shelves would fit along the walls. A cozy reading corner could go in the back. A counter near the door. A place for community events along the side. I ran my hands over the chipped window frame and pictured it restored, clean, bright, alive. I called the number on the sign. The landlord met me 2 days later. He was a man named Curtis, with a kind voice and cautious eyes. He asked what I planned to open. When I told him, he hesitated. He asked if I had experience, if I understood the risks, if I had thought about online competition, if I knew the neighborhood well enough. His questions were fair, but I felt the weight behind them. Even strangers wondered whether someone like me could pull it off. Dad's laughter echoed again in my head. His disbelief. His dismissal. I felt my jaw tighten as I said yes to every question. I had considered the risks. I had prepared for the competition. I had done my homework. I was ready to sign if he was ready to let the space go to someone who would take care of it. Curtis studied me for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly and pulled a set of keys from his pocket. He handed them to me so gently it took me a second to realize he was giving me permission to move forward. The lease was long and filled with terms I did not fully understand. So I brought it to Noah. He read each page carefully, pointing out clauses to negotiate and sections that protected me. We sent it back with edits. A few days later, the landlord agreed to everything. When the lease arrived in its final form, I signed my name at the bottom and felt a strange mixture of fear and triumph rush through me. My hand shook slightly when I wrote the last letter of my name. I exhaled and placed the pen down slowly. The following week was filled with bank meetings. Even with the coin sales, I wanted a line of credit to help with renovation costs. The bank reviewed my documents, but the process was far from smooth. They scrutinized every detail. They asked for proof of the coin sales. They requested statements, appraisal documents, and letters from the appraisers. They asked to see business projections, plans, budgets. At one point, a loan officer leaned back in her chair and told me gently that new business owners often underestimate how difficult the first year can be. I kept my voice steady, though inside I felt a tightening in my chest. I knew what she meant. I did not have family backing. I did not have industry experience. I did not have an obvious safety net. I only had determination and enough capital to survive the early months if things went slowly. I explained that I understood and that I was prepared. She nodded and told me she would push the application through. When I left the bank, the cold air hit me like a slap. For one brief moment, I wondered if I was in over my head, if Dad had been right all along, if the bookstore idea really was a childish dream. But then I walked past a small bulletin board near the sidewalk and saw a flyer for a local writers' meetup. I imagined them sitting in a corner of my shop, sharing words and coffee, filling air with something warm and human. The image anchored me. I reached into my pocket and felt the keys to the shop. Metal warmed from my hand. I closed my fist around them and kept walking. That evening, I drove to the storefront. The sun was low, and the building glowed faintly in its light. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, listening to the familiar creak of the floorboards. Dust swirled gently through the air. The place felt old and worn, but also full of promise. I found an empty spot on the wall near the register and hung a small cork board. I pressed the key to the front door into the cork, letting it stick there at an angle. A single symbol. Simple. Quiet. Powerful. This shop would be mine. Not a dream. Not a joke Dad could laugh at, not something for Brooke to dismiss. Something real, something I was building with intention, something that grew from the pieces Grandfather left behind. I touched the key lightly and let my hand fall back to my side. My heart felt steady again. The shop was beginning to take shape, even if only in outlines and imagination. I locked up and stepped outside, looking back at the dusty window and the faded sign above the door. The air smelled like evening, like something on the edge of becoming. I walked toward my car, knowing that tomorrow I would bring in cleaning. Supplies, paint, tools. Those shelves would soon arrive. Those books would eventually line the walls. That I was building something no one believed I could. The shop had been taking shape for weeks, and by the time the front sign was delivered, the space no longer looked like the abandoned room I first walked into. The paint had cured into a warm honey shade. The shelves stood proudly along the walls. The floor smelled faintly of lemon oil from the hours I spent polishing it. When I stepped inside each morning, I felt like I was walking into a version of myself I had never been allowed to meet. Customers began arriving in a slow and steady stream. At first, it was just curious neighbors peeking in through the windows. Then a couple of high school girls who wandered through the stationery aisle, laughing softly as they picked up bright pens and glittering journals. The space felt alive, in a gentle way. Every footprint on the floor, every smile exchanged, every book that left my hands and entered someone else's felt like a stitch, repairing something I once thought was permanently torn. One afternoon, the front door opened and a woman stepped inside. She was in her 60s, dressed in a cozy cardigan the color of buttermilk. her gray hair pulled into a soft bun. She walked with a calm steadiness, carrying herself like someone who had lived through a great deal and learned to move with grace anyway. She offered me a warm smile and said her name was Rachel Bloom. She moved through the shop with slow appreciation. She traced her fingers along the spines of books, paused at a display of handmade cards, smiled to herself, as though she was recognizing lost friends. I watched her in the quiet between customers, drawn to the way her presence seemed to fill the space without crowding it. When she brought her chosen items to the counter, she looked at me with clear, gentle eyes. She asked how long I had dreamed of opening a bookstore. I told her the truth. Since college. Since a time when I had no idea how to make it happen, and no one around me believed I ever could. I mentioned it lightly, intending to let the comment drift away, but she held my gaze. She said that sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who have the smallest view of us. She said it without bitterness, only quiet understanding, like someone who had seen the same pattern many times before. Those words sat in my chest long after she left. Over the next week, she returned twice, each time buying a small stack of books or a few pieces of writing paper. She told me about her love of letters, how she wrote to friends scattered across the country. She said handwritten words carried a kind of truth that phones and screens never could. When she laughed, her shoulders lifted like a wave, rising and breaking softly. I found myself looking forward to her visits, not for the sale, but for the sense of grounding she brought. Talking to her felt like sitting in the presence of someone who understood a kind of ache without needing to name it. Word about the shop spread across the neighborhood. Retired teachers came in, searching for classics they used to assign. Young mothers browsed children's books while their toddlers chased each other between the shelves. A paramedic who worked night shifts told me she bought blank journals here because writing helped her make sense of the things she saw on the job. Slowly, the shop became more than a store. It became a little harbor for people who felt overlooked or overwhelmed in various corners of their own lives. One evening, after closing, I sat at the counter counting the register. My body felt tired, but a steady contentment warmed through me like a slow-burning fire. For the first time in many years, I felt anchored, not because of approval or validation, but because I was doing something that felt real. When my phone buzzed, I reached for it without much thought. The notification made my breath still for a moment. Brooke had posted a new photo. It was taken in bright daylight. She stood beside the Tesla wearing a winter outfit that looked more expensive than anything I had ever owned. Her hand rested delicately on the hood. Her smile was practiced, wide but not quite reaching her eyes. The caption read, "Feeling blessed beyond words. Dream car. Family love." A younger version of myself might have felt a sharp, hot sting at the sight of it. I might have replayed the moment Dad handed her the keys. I might have felt that awful weight of being the daughter who got $10, and a joke disguised as a gift. But sitting there under the warm shop lights, I felt none of that. I saw a woman clinging to something shiny because she needed it to reflect a version of herself she hoped the world might accept. I set the phone face down on the counter and let the silence settle. My store, my shelves, my customers, my life. None of it depended on my family anymore. None of it required permission or applause. I had walked away from Christmas night with a piggy bank in one hand and humiliation in my chest. But now, that humiliation has morphed into clarity. Distance had made room for my own voice. The next morning, Rachel walked in again carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. She placed one in front of me and folded her arms gently, leaning against the counter as if we had known each other for years. She asked how I was doing, but not in that casual, empty way people sometimes ask. She asked with real attention. I told her the shop was coming together and that the community had been kinder than I expected. She nodded slowly, like she was waiting for something more. Then I found myself telling her about the family I left behind. I told her about Brooke, about Dad, about the Christmas party I walked away from. My voice stayed steady through most of it, but there was a quiet trembling underneath that I tried to hide. When I finished, Rachel exhaled softly and rested her hand over mine. She told me that women often spend their early years trying to prove they are worthy of love, support, or recognition. But at some point, life forces you to stop chasing and start choosing. Choosing peace, choosing dignity, choosing yourself. She said she once lived in a house where she felt like a ghost trailing behind the men in her family. She said she spent years waiting for them to notice her dreams, only to realize they did not have the capacity to see past their own. She told me that her own turning point came when she stopped trying to earn what they never planned to give. Her words moved through me like ripples across a lake. When she left, the shop felt fuller again, not with customers, but with a quiet sense of direction. That afternoon, as I adjusted a row of journals near the window, the sunlight folded across the room in warm ribbons. A few customers browsed quietly. The scent of coffee from the cafe next door drifted under the door. For the first time in a long time, I felt completely unburdened. At closing time, I locked the door and stood in the dim room for a moment. I ran my hand along the nearest shelf. I thought about the life I used to chase. The feeling of never being enough, the constant battle to earn approval that always slipped from reach. I had spent so many years trying to shrink myself into whatever made things easier for everyone else. But now, standing in the soft glow of my own space, I felt something expand instead. This life did not need to match anyone else's expectations. It did not need to prove anything. It simply needed to be mine. Later that night, I saw that Brooke had posted yet another photo with the Tesla. This time she stood inside the car with the panoramic roof open, her hand raised in a playful way. She had a long caption about gratitude and blessings and living the dream. I looked at the image for a brief moment, expecting to feel the familiar pang. Instead, the feeling that rose in me was a simple, unshakable neutrality. Her dream was not mine. Her world was not mine. Her applause was not mine. And the longer I stared, the more I understood something quietly profound. I no longer wanted to be seen by people who had never bothered to look in the first place. I closed the app and placed my phone on the nightstand. My room was quiet, and through the window I could see the faint glow of the streetlights brushing the tops of the trees. Everything about the moment felt calm, but beneath that calm, a thought began to form, a steady, clear thought that did not carry anger or bitterness, only certainty. The life I had built so far was already proof of who I was, but there was still something left to say. Not to them directly, not in a fight, but in a way that belonged entirely to me. It was time to speak. Not loudly, not cruelly, not to hurt anyone, but to affirm the truth I had earned. And as I lay back on the pillows, watching the shadows shift along the ceiling, I knew that whatever came next would be mine to define. It was time to let the world see what silence had taught me. I knew the moment had arrived while I lay in bed, staring into the low glow of morning light slipping through my blinds. A quiet certainty pressed against my ribs. Not anger, not spite, something steadier. A need to state the truth without raising my voice. A need to claim, in the simplest way possible, the life I had built without any of them. I reached for my phone and scrolled through the photos I had taken the week before. One was of my house in Fort Worth, sunlight warming the porch, the little rosemary bush I had planted on the left side already reaching upward. Another was of the shop, marigold books and paper, captured at the perfect moment just before sunset. The gold sign reflected soft light across the front windows. It looked like a place with a pulse. I selected both photos and placed them side by side. My thumb hovered above the caption bar for several seconds, not because I doubted myself, but because I understood the weight of what I was about to do. My family had never listened to my words, not when I spoke gently, and not when I spoke in frustration. They only understood proof. So I wrote the shortest truth I could. Thanks for the $10 gift. I finally invested in something real. I stared at the sentence for a long moment. It was not cruel. It was not exaggerated. It was simply factual. My investment has created a life. Meanwhile, the $10 had been meant as a reminder of my supposed place. And yet, here I was, holding proof that their dismissal had been the first crack in their own foundation. I hit the post. For a moment, nothing happened. The house was still. The early light remained gentle. The world remained quiet. Then the phone buzzed once. Then again. Then again. Notifications tumbled in, filling the screen in a fast cascade. People from my old job liked the post. A few customers from the shop commented with congratulations. Someone wrote that the storefront looked magical. Another asked when I would host a reading event. Their kindness warmed me, but I knew the reaction I had truly been waiting for was still coming. It arrived 20 minutes later. A text from Mom. Then another. Then another. The messages began as confusion. What is this? What are these pictures? Why did you post this? Then confusion shifted into something sharper. You should have told us you bought a house. You should have told us about the store. We are your family. We deserved to know. My pulse stayed steady as my phone vibrated in my hand. I did not reply. I walked into the kitchen and brewed coffee, letting the scent fill the room, while the notifications kept coming. Dad texted next. At first, it was a simple message. Call us. Then another. We are trying to understand what is happening. Then another. This feels disrespectful. You should not post things like this without talking to us. I took a sip of coffee and let the warmth settle into my chest. It was the first time in years that I felt fully in control of a conversation I was not participating in. Then the phone rang. Mom's name lit the screen in big white letters. I let it ring until it stopped. It rang again. Then again. Each call rolled to voicemail, and each time I felt a strange, quiet strength rise in me. Not today. Not anymore. Around 11 in the morning, while I was straightening books at the shop, my phone buzzed with another notification. This one made me pause because it was a name I had expected eventually. Brooke. Her message was short at first. What did you mean by that post? Then another message came a minute later. Are you trying to embarrass us? Then a third. Or are you trying to say something else? Something about the piggy bank. My hand tightened slightly around the phone. I knew this was the moment things would shift. She was smart enough to connect dots when she felt threatened. The shop lights reflected in the phone screen as I watched her typing bubble appear and disappear. Her next message stretched longer. She said she had been thinking about the $10. She said it suddenly occurred to her that the piggy bank had felt heavier than it should have. She said she remembered the day Dad took it from a dusty box in the garage, the same box that held some of Grandpa Walter's old belongings. A small ache formed at the edge of my chest when I read that. She had noticed. All this time, she had noticed something about him, something Dad had overlooked completely. Another message arrived. What exactly was in that piggy bank? The store was quiet. Only the faint hum of the air conditioning filled the space. Sunlight stretched across the floorboards in long, warm stripes. I slipped my phone into my pocket and continued arranging the display table. I was not going to answer her. For years, I had carried the weight of their choices while they celebrated. Brooke as if she were the only daughter worth investing in. They had given me a $10 bill and a smirk disguised as generosity. They had made their intentions unmistakable. And now they wanted answers, only because my life suddenly looked interesting. No, not this time. A few minutes later, the phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Dad. His tone had shifted. He said he wanted to talk face to face. He said there had been misunderstandings. He said it was important for us to sit down as a family and clear things up. He said the post made them look foolish. I stepped back from the table and let those words settle in, not because they hurt, but because they confirmed everything I had suspected. They were not upset that I was hurt. They were upset that they now looked like the kind of family who would treat one daughter like an afterthought. The truth was never a problem for them until it became public. I spent the rest of the afternoon helping customers find books, wrap small gift sets, and chatting quietly with regulars. The shop thrived around me with a soft warmth, and for the first time, I could breathe freely in the middle of conflict, instead of shrinking from it. By evening, their messages had grown more frantic. Mom sent long paragraphs about misunderstandings and family unity, and how I had always been the strongest one. Dad sent short bursts of insistence. Brooke sent what felt like a catalog of her shifting emotions. First confusion, then anger, then suspicion, then guilt, then back to anger again. But at 6:50 in the evening, when the last customer left and I locked the door behind them, a final message from Brooke appeared on my screen. I know those coins came from Grandpa. You need to tell me what they were worth. I felt the air around me turn still. She knew. Maybe not the full truth yet, maybe not the value Lydia had confirmed, but she knew enough to understand that the balance they had cultivated for years had tilted. I stood behind the counter and rested my hands on the cool wood. The shop lights cast a soft glow on the shelves. My breath felt steady and deep. I did not reply. I placed the phone face down on the counter and turned off the lights. 1 section at a time. The room dimmed to a soft golden haze as I walked toward the door. Outside, the warm evening air brushed my face as I locked up. My phone was still quiet in my hand, but I knew more messages would come. More demands. More questions. They had finally recognized the truth. They had handed me the very thing Dad had dismissed for years. They had given me a future they never intended to give. And now, they wanted it back. I slid my phone into my bag, walked to my car, and sat for a moment, with both hands on the steering wheel. The street was quiet. A few porch lights flickered on in the distance. My heartbeat was calm. They would not be getting an answer. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Not ever. I started the engine, feeling the hum beneath my feet, and backed out of the parking lot. The shop faded behind me as the evening sky deepened into a soft violet. The power had shifted, and all I needed to do was remain silent. I turned into my driveway that evening with the soft hum of the engine easing into silence as I parked. The porch light glowed across the walkway. For a moment, I closed my eyes and simply breathed. The certainty I felt earlier remained steady inside me. But when I opened my eyes, I saw a shadow move on the front porch. My heart jolted before settling into a cold, even beat. They were here. Dad stood closest to the door, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Mom sat on the porch bench, hunched slightly, her eyes darting between Dad and the front walkway as if she expected me to run. And Brooke stood beside the railing, arms crossed, her foot tapping, her face stiff with accusation rather than concern. I stepped out of the car slowly, locking the door behind me. None of them said a word until I reached the base of the porch steps. Dad cleared his throat, a gesture he always used before trying to sound authoritative. "Marissa, we need to talk." His tone was clipped, controlled, as if he were the one granting permission instead of asking for a moment of my time. I walked up the steps without pausing. The air carried the scent of warm cedar from the planters on each side of me. Door. I stopped several feet from them, leaving space between us that felt appropriate. He continued. "We saw your post." He hesitated for a fraction of a second. The house, the shop, the tone of your caption. "We think some conversations need to happen before things get blown out of proportion." Mom nodded quickly. Her eyes were wide, anxious. "Family should talk," she said, folding her hands tightly in her lap. She sounded like someone rehearsing lines she did not believe. Brooke lifted her chin. "What was in that piggy bank? Just tell us." Her tone was sharp, the kind of voice she used when something slipped out of her control and she needed to claw it back. I took a breath, slow and deep. The porch light buzzed faintly above us. "This is not the time or the place," I said, my voice calm, steady. "If you want to talk, we need to have an actual conversation, not an ambush on my porch." Dad bristled. "We are your family. We do not need an appointment to talk to you." He stepped closer, his jaw set. "And we deserve to understand what Grandpa left behind. Things like family assets are not meant to be hidden." I felt a cold shift in my chest. Family assets. That was the phrase he chose. No apology. No regret. Not recognition. Before I could answer, headlights swept across the driveway as another car pulled in. A sleek black sedan slowed behind mine. The driver stepped out and closed the door with a quiet, intentional motion. It was Paul Whitaker, the attorney who had helped me finalize the sale of the coin collection and document the transfer of Grandpa Walter's personal property. His presence was calm, unobtrusive, almost understated. But in that moment, he felt like solid ground. He walked toward the porch, adjusting his glasses slightly. "Miss Cole?" he said with a small nod, addressing me first. Dad stiffened. "Who is this?" Paul stood beside me, his hands loosely at his sides, My name is Paul Whitaker. I represent your daughter in a few matters regarding her grandfather's estate. Dad scoffed. That is ridiculous. There was no estate. My father did not leave behind much of anything. Certainly nothing worth hiring a lawyer over. Paul regarded him with a composed expression. Actually, that is not entirely accurate. Mr. Cole, your father left behind a collection of historical coins, which he designated as a personal gift to your daughter Marissa. These items were stored among his belongings and discovered in a piggy bank she received from you, which legally constitutes a completed gift. Mom blinked rapidly. A gift. That is all it was. A silly $10 thing. Paul continued without raising his voice. Once a gift is given, the giver has no legal claim over its contents, regardless of whether they understood its value at the time. He paused. The documentation clearly supports that the ownership belongs to Miss Cole, alone. Dad stared at him, his face reddening. This cannot be correct. Brooke stepped forward, her eyes wide with alarm. So the coins were real. The value was real. You were saying she owns all of it. Paul nodded calmly. Correct. And any attempt to dispute ownership would not be in your favor. The appraisal, the transfer documentation, and the sale records are protected under state law. Brooke's expression shifted into disbelief mixed with envy. So all this time, you were holding on to a fortune, while the rest of us had no idea. Her words hung in the air like a sour mist. A sharp pulse moved through me, but not of anger. It was something more like clarity. They had never cared whether I was hurting. They only cared when they thought I had something they wanted. Dad stepped closer. Marissa, listen. Family assets should be shared. It is unfair for you to keep something of that size to yourself. Your grandfather meant for the family to benefit from what he had. I met his eyes. The porch light reflected a faint glimmer across his glasses. Grandpa meant for me to have something of my own. He gave those coins to me because he knew no one else ever gave me anything, without conditions. Dad shook his head in frustration. This is not about conditions. This is about a family staying together. I took a step forward, feeling the firmness in my voice settle like a stone finally finding the apse. Ground it belonged on. I am not the one who walked away from this family. I am the one who was pushed to the edges until I disappeared. What you gave me that night was not a gift. It was a reminder of how little you thought of me. Mom's face tightened. That is not fair, Marissa. You have always been the strong one. You did not need the same attention Brooke needed. I looked at her with sadness that felt old and quiet. That is exactly the problem, Mom. You spent my entire life telling me strength meant going without, but it only ever meant you did not have to show up for me. Brooke let out a disbelieving laugh. So now you are punishing us over a misunderstanding. It was not a misunderstanding, I said softly. It never was. Paul stepped aside. Allow space for the conversation to rest entirely between us. My heart beat calmly in my chest as I looked at each of them in turn. I did not walk away because of money. I walked away because of how you treated me. Because you made it clear for years that my worth was smaller than hers. Because the $10 was not a joke to me. It was the last confirmation I needed. David opened his mouth as if to argue, but no words came. Mom looked uncertain for the first time, her gaze shifting downward. Brooke's jaw clenched, her eyes burning with resentment. Paul glanced at me as if asking silently whether he should intervene further. I shook my head. I looked at my family one more time, my voice steady as I said, I am living my life now. Not the version you ignored, but the version I chose. And none of you get to claim a part of it unless I offer it. You do not have that access anymore. The words settled heavily, but not harshly. They were simply true. Das straightened, his pride wounded. Brooke crossed her arms and stepped back, her expression tightening when she noticed a group of neighbors slowing down. As they walked past my house, recognition flickered in their eyes. She realized she was being watched. The golden image she held so carefully was cracking. Mom rose from the bench, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Marissa, please think about this. We are still family. Blood might make us related, I said quietly, but it does not make you entitled to me. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Dad turned first, muttering something under his breath as he walked down the step. Mom followed, wiping beneath her eyes, though I could not tell if it was sadness or embarrassment. Brooke lingered a moment longer. Her voice trembled with a hint of bitterness. "You changed everything the moment you walked away." "No," I said, meeting her gaze. "Everything changed because you never believed I could." She looked at me as if searching for something familiar, something she could still control. But she found nothing. She turned and walked to the car without another word. I watched their taillights fade down the street until the night returned to stillness. The porch light hummed softly overhead. Inside my chest, a calm finality settled. They had come for access and left with none. After my family drove away that night and the darkness settled across the street, something quiet but undeniable shifted inside me. It was not a triumph. It was not even a relief. It was the simple settling of truth, the way a house finally stops creaking once a storm has moved on. The silence that followed became the new rhythm of my life, steady and unforced. Weeks passed, then months, and my days filled with a gentle consistency that I had never known before. The shop grew busier as people learned about it, not because of any fancy marketing plan, but because someone would stop by, find a book they loved, and tell a friend who told another friend. Sometimes it felt like the place carried its own heartbeat. On Saturday mornings, retired teachers gathered at the back table to trade mystery novels and gossip kindly. Teenagers drifted through after school, buying pens and sketchbooks with shy smiles. People left handwritten notes on the community board near the window. Notes about book clubs, about gratitude, about the little things that made them feel less alone. And every so often, when I unlocked the door at 8 in the morning, and the warm smell of paper and wood rose around me, I felt a wave of something I had not experienced in years. Belonging. Life had not become perfect. There were slow days at the shop when I wondered about bills, and there were quiet evenings in my house when loneliness brushed the edges of my thoughts. Healing is not a finish line. It is a collection of moments where you choose yourself again and again. Some days I felt strong. Some days I felt tired. But every day, I felt free. My family never reached out again. Not one call, not one message, not even a half-hearted attempt to reconnect. For a while, I checked my phone in the evenings, out of nothing more than habit. After a few weeks, I stopped checking. After a few months, I stopped wondering. People assume losing a family is like ripping off a bandage, but the truth is quieter. It feels like walking through your house at night and realizing certain rooms no longer belong to you. And eventually, you stop trying to turn on their lights. One warm afternoon, as I rearranged the front display, my eyes landed on the piggy bank, sitting on the counter in the back office. The same clay little thing Dad handed me on Christmas night. The one they laughed over. The one that turned out to contain the only inheritance anyone in that family ever gave me without strings. I carried it to the front room and placed it on a small shelf near the register. It looked almost decorative there, its little pink ears catching the sun from the front window. I did not add a sign or a plaque. I did not tell its story. It simply sat there, quiet and full of history no one needed to know. A few days later, a woman browsing the stationery table pointed at it and asked if it was for sale. I smiled and shook my head. "It is just a reminder," I told her. "Of what?" she asked, tilting her head curiously. I paused for a moment, choosing my words carefully. "Of what grows when you stop waiting for someone to see your worth." She smiled gently and walked on. She did not press for more, and I did not offer more. There was nothing left to explain. The more the shop grew, the more I realized the life I had built did not just belong to me. It belonged to the people who stepped inside and felt safe. It belonged to the conversations that unraveled quietly between strangers. It belonged to moments when someone picked up a book and said they felt seen. Sometimes Rachel stopped by with coffee and stories about her garden. Sometimes Noah visited to check on paperwork and ended up leaving with a stack of travel books. Each bringing a small piece of themselves into the space. My life was not glamorous. It did not shine the way Brooke's online photos once did, but it glowed in a steady way, like a candle that does not need to burn bright to warm an entire room. And that was enough. There were nights when I sat on my porch under the Texas sky and felt the ache of what I had lost. Family is not something you can leave behind without feeling the shape of the absence. I missed the idea of them more than the people themselves. I missed the version of family I never had. I missed the girl I used to be, the one who kept believing she would earn a place someday. But missing is not the same as wanting to return. Missing is just a sign that something mattered. What I kept instead was my dignity, my peace, my voice, my legacy, however simple. And what they lost was the story they used to tell about themselves, the story where they were generous, loving, fair, the story where Brooke was the shining center and I was the dependable shadow. They did not lose money. They lost the comfort of believing they had been good to me. Some truths are heavier than coins. One evening, as I swept the floor before closing, light streamed in through the windows and painted gold squares across the wood. I paused in the middle of the room and let the broom rest in my hand. The quiet settled deep. The kind of quiet that comes after choosing yourself, not out of spite, but out of survival. I looked around the shop and then at the little piggy bank on its shelf. My throat tightened, but not with sadness, with gratitude, with understanding. This was my life now. Built without permission, built without applause, built from the fragments of something old and the hope of something new. And as I turned off the lights, closing the shop for the night, I felt a warm certainty rise in me. I did not need them to see me anymore. I had finally seen myself. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this: silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.